Welcome to the debate. Imagine sitting in a command bunker, right? Buried beneath, say, 100 meters of solid granite.
The safest place on Earth, theoretically.
Right, exactly. By 20th century standards, you are perfectly safe from any conventional weapon. But right now, hovering silently in low Earth orbit is a 20-foot-long solid tungsten telephone pole.
Just waiting.
Just waiting. If that pole simply lets go and drops, you have exactly 11 seconds of radar warning. And, well, no physical wall in the world can save you.
It's terrifying. But, that exact same vulnerability is true of the airspace above our cities right now. We saw it just weeks ago on February 28th during the Iranian barrage.
Oh, right, the swarm.
Yeah. Over 2,000 drones and 500 ballistic missiles just filling the sky. Our current defense, it relies on firing million-dollar interceptors at $1,000 drones.
The math doesn't work.
It doesn't. We are completely exhausted by the math.
And we are sitting here in March of 2026, and the theoretical has, it's suddenly become the immediate. Because on February 5th, the New START treaty officially expired.
With absolutely no successor agreement in place.
None. So we are now facing the strategic and, frankly, existential implications of newly accessible, physics-based systems. Specifically, we're talking about orbital kinetic bombardment platforms, the so-called rods from God, and these new acoustic area denial perimeters designated under the system name MICA.
Which brings us to our central question for today. Do these emerging physics-based systems represent the irreversible collapse of global deterrence, or are they the necessary evolution toward perfect defense and planetary-scale engineering?
Right. And I argue that these systems irreversibly destabilize global security by completely bypassing arms control, collapsing the cost of destruction, and enabling unanswerable decapitation strikes.
And I contend that this exact same physics offers the ultimate defensive perimeter against swarm warfare and, provides the exact tools required to expand humanity through planetary terraforming.
Let's start with the sheer mechanics of orbital kinetic bombardment because they fundamentally break our existing security architecture. The concept of Project Thor is terrifying because of its simplicity.
It really is just dropping heavy things.
Exactly. We are talking about tungsten cylinders, 20 feet long, weighing 12,000 kilograms. You drop them from low Earth orbit. By the time they hit the surface, they are traveling at Mach 10.
Incredible speed.
Yeah. The kinetic energy delivered at that velocity is equivalent to 11.5 tons of TNT. But, and this is the crazy part, without a single atom of radioactive fallout. It is a completely clean weapon of mass destruction.
Right, it leaves absolutely no prohibited residue. The crater has no half-life. You could literally walk into the impact zone an hour later.
Which brings us to the legal and the economic breakdown. If you look at the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, it specifically prohibits weapons of mass destruction in orbit.
But not tungsten.
No, because legally, a solid tungsten rod is not a bomb. It has no explosive, no chemical payload, no fissile material. Legally, it's just a mass.
Just a rock, essentially.
Just a rock.
And the electromagnetic railgun used to push it out of orbit because it imparts momentum without chemical combustion. It is legally classified as a propulsion system. We have a treaty loophole the size of a telephone pole.
Yeah, the lawyers really missed that one.
They did. And historically, the only thing keeping this in the realm of science fiction was the sheer cost of the launch. Under the old Space Shuttle program, getting a payload to orbit cost roughly $54,000 per kilogram.
Right.
Today, the SpaceX Starship architecture has collapsed that cost to somewhere between $13 and $32 a kilogram.
The economics haven't just shifted, they've completely inverted the board.
Inverted is an understatement, honestly. A fully armed, nuclear battery-powered orbital kinetic platform now costs roughly $210 to $250 million to deploy.
Wow. That is the price of just 2.5 F-35 fighter jets. And with New START gone, we're looking at a weapon that produces zero launch signature, gives zero time to evacuate, and costs less than a traditional air wing. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction is completely obsolete because the foundational premise of survivability is gone.
Look, the offensive capability is profound, absolutely. I'm not denying that. But you cannot look at the falling cost of orbital mechanics without looking at the defensive brilliance of what acoustic area denial systems, like Michael, bring to this exact same geopolitical moment.
Okay, let's talk about Michael.
Yeah. Look at the broken math of our current air defense. I mentioned the February 28th barrage. Defenders were firing Patriot interceptors that cost $4 million apiece just to shoot down off-the-shelf drones.
The Shads, yeah.
Right. The adversary isn't trying to out-innovate us anymore. They are just trying to exhaust us. When you use finite precision physical missiles to fight mass, your magazine eventually runs out.
The exchange rate of interceptors to incoming rounds is, well, it's definitely a failing equation.
It has already failed. And this is exactly why Michael is a necessary evolution. Michael stands for the voice of the multitude, and it completely steps away from the idea of physical interceptors.
So how does it actually work?
Instead of missiles, it uses compact fission reactors. These are the kilopower class systems to charge massive capacitor banks. It then discharges that energy through a phased acoustic transducer array.
A wall of sound.
To put it simply, yes. It projects a literal wall of intense acoustic pressure. And the physics here is just brilliant. Most modern submunitions and drones, they use proximity fuses to know when they are near a target, right?
Right, radar or laser fuses.
Exactly. When they hit that high-intensity acoustic wall, the intense pressure variation fools the fuse into thinking it has encountered a solid physical object. So the weapon just detonates itself in empty air, miles away from its target.
Wait, hold on. A wall of sound? How does that work against something like a hypersonic glide vehicle? I mean, a hypersonic missile doesn't rely on a simple proximity fuse, and it's moving at what, Mach 5 or faster?
It's actually even more effective against hypersonics.
Really?
Yeah. Hypersonic vehicles survive those incredible speeds because they ride on an incredibly delicate, smooth cushion of air, which is called the aerodynamic boundary layer. If that layer gets disrupted, the friction burns the vehicle up instantly.
Oh, wow.
The acoustic wall creates massive, localized density fluctuations in the air. Think of it like throwing invisible speed bumps into that smooth cushion of air. At Mach 5, hitting a speed bump of sound pressure destabilizes the boundary layer entirely. The vehicle tumbles, the friction spikes, and it tears itself apart in milliseconds.
So you're basically treating the air itself as the weapon.
Exactly. Michael operates on a bottomless magazine of jewels, not physical stones or missiles. It completely alters the exchange rate of war. Once you pay the capital cost of $500 million to $1.5 billion to build the array, the marginal cost of destroying an incoming target is effectively zero.
Right. You just need electricity.
Yes, a swarm of 2,000 drones is not 2,000 times harder to defeat than a single drone. The acoustic wall treats the entire volume of air as hostile. It destroys everything within that volume simultaneously.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. It's like building an invincible shield for your house, but simultaneously dropping the cost of a civilization-ending sword so low that any mid-sized corporation can buy one. Yes. Mikkel permanently protects a fixed point. You can put an acoustic array around a naval base, a carrier group, or a capital city. But the very orbital launch economics that make deploying a massive acoustic array possible, they also democratize extinction.
Democratize extinction.
Yes, at $250 million for a Rods from God orbital platform, the threat of non-state actors acquiring kinetic strike capabilities is no longer hypothetical. You are protecting a few localized perimeters, while the sky above us becomes an uncontrolled, unregulated minefield.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are equating the plunging cost of raw materials and the rocket launch with the capability to actually field a functional weapons system.
But the components are cheap now.
Yes, the tungsten itself is cheap, and the Starship flight is cheap now, but orbital platforms still require massive manufacturing logistics. We're talking about the satellite bus, the electromagnetic launcher, and crucially,
the radioisotope thermoelectric generators, the nuclear batteries required to keep the system alive and aligned in deep space.
Right, the RTGs.
Exactly. You cannot build these components in a garage. The incredibly complex supply chain for weapons-grade orbital infrastructure keeps this firmly out of the hands of minor non-state actors.
Okay, but even if we assume only major nation-states possess them, the strategic ambiguity they create is catastrophic. Let's ground this in how deterrence actually works.
All right.
Deterrence requires knowing exactly who to shoot back at. If a country launches an intercontinental ballistic missile, it produces a massive infrared launch plume that our early warning satellites see instantly. We know who fired it, and they know we know.
True.
But we currently have over 12,000 active satellites in orbit. When an orbital platform drops a tungsten rod, there is no launch plume. The deorbit burn is minuscule. The rod simply stops being held.
It's essentially an invisible drop.
It's the ultimate anonymous sniper. By the time ground radar detects the re-entry vehicle cutting through the atmosphere, you have 11 seconds until impact.
Just 11 seconds.
Yeah. If attribution takes hours because, you have to back calculate the trajectory through a highly crowded orbital plane to figure out which satellite dropped it, but the impact takes 11 seconds, deterrence completely fails.
I hear you, but...
And it gets worse when you look at the mechanics of the rod itself. They've engineered an offset nose weight on the penetrator. When it hits the ground, it doesn't just punch straight down. It precesses, it wobbles on its axis, essentially turning into a massive drill.
Right, the drilling effect.
It bores a channel slightly wider than its own diameter, which completely eliminates shaft friction. It can penetrate hundreds of feet deep through solid rock. It threatens the deepest command facilities on Earth, NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain, Iran's 100-meter-deep Pickaxe Mountain. Decapitation strikes against national leadership become completely conventional and totally unanswerable.
And I look at that exact same capability and see a restoration of consequences. If you read the source materials reference to the Book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 15 through 17, it describes the kings and generals hiding in the caves and the rocks of the mountains, begging the mountains to fall on them and hide them.
A grim image.
It is, but think about it. For 70 years, the architects of war have been able to wage it from absolute safety. They bury themselves under hundreds of feet of granite, completely insulated from the destruction they order for the rest of us.
Well,
the offset nose drill neutralizes the exact bunkers that bad actors use to hide. It strips away the illusion that anyone is beyond the reach of consequence.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because stripping away command authority is the absolute nightmare scenario of nuclear deterrence theory.
How so?
Think about the psychology here. When generals are in Cheyenne Mountain, they feel invincible. When that invincibility shatters, paranoia takes over. If a nuclear-armed adversary perceives that their deep command structures are suddenly vulnerable to a conventional decapitation strike, meaning they could be wiped out in 11 seconds, without a single nuclear weapon being used against them, their incentive is to launch their nuclear arsenal at the very first sign of conflict.
A use-it-or-lose-it mentality.
Exactly. Or worse, to pre-delegate launch authority to lower-level field commanders who might panic. By threatening the bunker, you don't eliminate war, you practically guarantee chaotic, disorganized nuclear retaliation.
But we are so obsessed with looking down at the Earth targeting bunkers that we're missing the bigger picture.
The bigger picture?
Yes. What happens if we take that exact same capacity to hurl mass and point it at a dead planet? This brings us to the dual-use dilemma, and frankly, the core of why this physics must be embraced. We have to look at the Centennial Collapse Venus terraforming model.
Okay, wait, you're pivoting from bunker busting to planetary engineering?
I'm talking about moving mountains on a planetary scale. The exact physics of the rods from God is mandatory for the survival and expansion of the human species. The Venus plan details using 4-ton tungsten rods fired 30,000 times a year to strike the Venusian surface.
30,000 strikes?
Yes, let's talk about how that actually works. Venus has a toxic, carbon-choked atmosphere that traps heat. Venus's crust is highly basaltic. When you smash the planet's crust with kinetic impactors, you excavate and expose 750,000 cubic meters of fresh,
calcium and magnesium silicates per strike.
That's a massive amount of material.
It is. Think of that fresh, unweathered rock like a giant chemical sponge. When it hits the atmosphere, it chemically binds with the CO2, pulling it out of the sky and turning it into solid rock. It's essentially forced, high-speed atmospheric weathering.
So you're literally battering the planet to expose a carbon sink.
Exactly. And we pair this with teraton-scale Teller-Ulam nuclear devices. Just to clarify for the listener, we're talking about thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs, but on a scale of 1,000 gigatons.
Terrifying scale.
Unfathomable. We detonate them in the middle atmosphere to trigger atmospheric earthquakes. Massive standing pressure waves that literally drive the toxic atmosphere out into space. Add orbital mirrors to create a 1,500-degree polar thermal gradient to freeze out what's left, and within a century, you collapse a hostile greenhouse planet into a proto-habitable world. Banning this kinetic and nuclear physics because we are afraid of it traps humanity on one vulnerable planet forever.
But intent cannot be governed by physics. The physics is entirely agnostic. The exact same hardware, the same orbital platform, the same electromagnetic launcher, the same tungsten composition used to stripe a Martian ice deposit to release water vapor, well, it can just as easily be aimed at a terrestrial capital city.
True.
The hardware is the same.
The Outer Space Treaty cannot distinguish between a planetary engineering tool and an orbital weapon because physically they are completely indistinguishable. You are asking us to trust that whoever controls the orbital high ground will only point these rods outward and never downward.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered the concept of Yisrael?
Yisrael?
Yeah. The source text uses this term not as a modern political state, but in its ancient etymological sense, one who wrestles with God. It represents the idea that humanity must actively wrestle with this dual-use power. The power to protect, the power to destroy, the power to create. It is all part of the exact same covenant.
Okay.
We cannot simply ban the physics out of fear, because that same fear prevents us from taking the next evolutionary step. We have to hold on to the power, wrestle with the immense danger of it, and build the institutions capable of wielding it responsibly.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Asking humanity to wrestle with a dual-use technology that offers zero warning time and unanswerable destructive power is a catastrophic risk in our current reality.
But without risk,
The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has the doomsday clock sitting at 89 seconds to midnight. We are in an environment where arms control treaties are dissolving in real time. Relying on the better angels of our nature, relying on intent when the cost of entry is a few fighter jets and the regulatory vacuum is absolute, is not stepping through an evolutionary threshold. It is a suicide pact.
The regulatory vacuum is exactly why we must advance systems like Mikhail and Tandem. The acoustic wall is inherently defensive. It cannot project force across the globe. It can only deny a perimeter.
Right.
When you pair the ultimate defense with the ultimate kinetic capability, you stabilize the board long enough to actually undertake these civilizational projects. You say the clock is at 89 seconds to midnight. I say the only way to turn the clock back is to expand the board entirely.
So where does this leave us today? To summarize my position, while I fully acknowledge that acoustic area denial offers a genuinely brilliant tactical defense against the mathematics of swarm warfare, we cannot ignore the larger picture. The proliferation of cheap, treaty-bypassing orbital kinetic weapons creates a permanent, invisible threat. It bypasses every defensive wall we have ever conceived and fundamentally collapses global deterrence.
My position remains that humanity is standing at a necessary evolutionary threshold. The physics that powers the voice of the multitude, Mikhail, offers the ultimate defense for our vulnerable perimeters. And the kinetic orbital physics provides the literal, mechanical tools to move mountains and terraform dead worlds. The risk is absolute, but so is the necessity.
I think the one area of convergence we share is the recognition of our immediate reality. The physics is deeply understood, the technology is already economically accessible.
Very accessible.
And the expiration of treaties like New START has left humanity completely unprepared for the era we have already entered.
We are living in the terrifying gap between the physics we have built and the institutions we lack.
Which brings us back to that profound tension you mentioned, the covenant. Let's just pause on the gravity of this. It's the uncomfortable reality that the power to perfectly protect a city, the power to completely destroy it, and the power to expand human life across the solar system, well, they all stem from the exact same physics equation.
Mass, velocity, and gravity.
At the start of this conversation, we talked about the fortress, the idea that for thousands of years, defense meant putting a thick, physical wall of stone between you and the threat. Now the wall is made of sound pressure, and the threat falls from a silent sky. I urge everyone listening to delve into the underlying strategic essays we've discussed today. We've reached the point where the fortress can no longer be built out of stone. The question is whether we can build one out of wisdom.
If you really think about human history, our entire concept of safety has always been tied directly to mass.
Right, yeah, just putting heavy things between you and whatever is trying to hurt you.
Exactly. Like if you want to protect something, you just put something really heavy in front of it. You build a wooden palisade. Then, a few centuries later, you upgrade to a thick stone castle.
And in the modern era, if you are a general or a head of state, you rely on absolute geological security. You dig a massive hole, you pour 50 feet of reinforced concrete, you pile a literal granite mountain on top of it, and you sit inside and say to yourself, there it is, we are untouchable.
But today is March 12, 2026. And, well, the sky has changed.
Dramatically so.
Right now, the geopolitical climate that you and I are living in is, it's undeniably tense. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has the doomsday clock sitting at exactly 89 seconds to midnight.
Which is unprecedented.
It really is.
Yeah.
And just last month, on February 5th, the New START nuclear treaty officially expired, with absolutely no replacement framework in sight. And then just 2 weeks ago, on February 28th, we all witnessed those massive military strikes by the U.S. and Israel and Iran, which were just immediately followed by these huge multi-nation drone and missile barrages. The entire strategic landscape of the Middle East, and frankly the world, has fundamentally altered in just a matter of days.
And because of that intense reality, before we really dive into the material you've brought us today, we need to make something explicitly clear to the listener.
Yes, absolutely.
In this deep dive, we are going to be unpacking some highly charged, extremely recent geopolitical events involving the U.S., Israel, Iran, Russia, and China. But we are approaching this from a position of strict, absolute neutrality.
Exactly. We are not here to take sides. We are not endorsing any government's viewpoints. We aren't justifying any military actions, whether they're left-wing, right-wing, or whatever. We aren't taking political stances.
Right. Our mission today is purely analytical.
We are just here to unpack the source material that you, the listener, provided us, which is this set of 3 extraordinary, highly interrelated strategic essays published literally just days ago here in 2026 by an author named Zachary David Enfield.
Our goal is to dissect the strategic, the economic, and honestly, most importantly, the physical frameworks presented in Enfield's texts. Because what these essays reveal is a total ground-up paradigm shift in physics, economics, and warfare.
Yeah.
We are going to explore the emergence of an unstoppable offensive weapon based in space, an inexhaustible defensive energy shield that completely rewrites the math of warfare, and, perhaps most staggeringly, how the exact same physics used to vaporize a military bunker could be redirected to terraform a dead planet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you handed me a stack of essays about, the future of orbital kinetic warfare, I was fully expecting to start in some Pentagon briefing room or maybe a sterile clean room at SpaceX.
Right, that would make sense.
But Enfield starts this massive exploration of 21st century military doctrine in, of all places, Hastings, Nebraska, which on the surface just feels like a complete non sequitur.
It does feel jarring at first, but he uses Hastings as this foundational metaphor for how power is stored and unleashed in the modern era. To really understand the weapons of 2026, you actually have to understand a bizarre historical coincidence that happened on those exact Nebraska.
Yeah, then you just put it in a tiny packet, move it easily, add water later, and physics and chemistry do all the heavy lifting.
And what Enfield finds so fascinating, and what honestly serves as the thesis for this entire deep dive, is what happens exactly 15 years later on those exact same plains outside Hastings.
Right.
In 1942, the United States government realizes they're entering a massive global war. They desperately need a place to manufacture, assemble, and store the munitions for the Second World War. And they choose 49,000 acres of flat, totally unremarkable prairie right outside Hastings to build the Naval Ammunition Depot.
And it wasn't just some small facility. The text says it becomes incredibly massive. At its peak, this one depot in Nebraska is producing and storing over 40% of the entire U.S. Navy's munitions.
It's staggering.
We were talking about 2,000 buildings and hundreds upon hundreds of reinforced concrete igloos just hiding out there in the prairie grass.
Enfield's point here is crucial to understand. The prairie itself was the strategy. Why Hastings? Well, first, it was perfectly central. Being equidistant from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts meant you could rapidly ship bombs to whichever theater needed them.
Makes logistical sense.
But more importantly, it was chosen because it was completely invisible. It was mundane. The Japanese Imperial Forces and the German High Command, they weren't running reconnaissance flights over the cornfields of Nebraska. They were looking at coastal shipyards. They were looking at major industrial centers.
The text even mentions that in September 1944, there was a massive accidental explosion at the depot. It left a crater 500 feet across, killed 9 men, shattered windows for miles.
Yeah.
And yet, the war machine just kept humming. It was so isolated, so insulated by the sheer boring vastness of the prairie that the rest of the world barely even noticed it happened. The thunder literally slept under the grass.
Exactly. And this is where Enfield bridges the metaphor. The underlying logic of Hastings as a munitions depot and the logic of Perkins inventing Kool-Aid are identical. The strategy is to take enormous potential, whether that is the sweetness of a beverage or the catastrophic destructive fury of high explosives, and reduce it to its simplest, most concentrated, most easily deliverable form.
Right.
You strip away all the excess weight, you place it in an environment that is perfectly secure specifically because nobody is looking there, and then when the time comes, you release it and let physics do the rest. Concentrate, store, release.
Which brings us right into the core of the first essay. If Hastings, Nebraska was the ultimate invisible storage magazine of the 1940s, Enfield argues that the ultimate invisible storage magazine of 2026 is low Earth orbit. And the concentrated powder, it isn't high explosives, it's something called the rods from God.
Or, to use his historical military designation, Project Thor. This is where Enfield introduces what he calls the physics of judgment.
Right, and let's spend some time on Project Thor, because this actually isn't a brand new concept, is it? The text notes it was originally proposed way back in the 1950s by a scientist and science fiction author named Jerry Pournelle.
Yeah, the core idea has been around for decades.
And when I was reading the specs for this weapon, I just couldn't believe how laughably simple it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's basically just a giant metal rock.
It is the absolute oldest weapon in human history, just scaled up to the terrifying mathematics of orbital mechanics. There is that famous quote attributed to Albert Einstein where he said he didn't know what weapons World War III would be fought with, but World War II would be fought with sticks and stones.
Right.
Enfield argues that Einstein was essentially right. He just didn't specify that the sticks would be forged from solid tungsten and the stones would be dropped from the vacuum of space.
Let's look at the exact specifications the author outlines, because they really help you, the listener, visualize the terror of this thing. We are talking about solid tungsten cylinders. They are 20 feet long and exactly 1 foot in diameter.
Right.
So if you're driving or walking right now and you're trying to picture this, it is precisely the size and shape of a standard wooden telephone pole you'd see on your street. But because it is made of solid tungsten, which is an incredibly dense metal, it's about 1.7 times denser than lead. A single one of these metal poles weighs 24,000 pounds.
That is 12 metric tons.
12 tons, just for one pole.
And the choice of tungsten is definitely not accidental. It is the defining engineering requirement for a kinetic orbital strike. You see, when any object re-enters the Earth's atmosphere from orbit, it is traveling at hypersonic speeds. The friction against the atmosphere, and more specifically the aerodynamic compression of the air directly in front of the object, generates immense, unimaginable heat.
Yeah, like spacecraft re-entering.
Exactly. If you dropped a steel telephone pole, it would just melt into slag. If you dropped a titanium one, it would ablate and burn away to nothing long before it ever reached the ground.
It would just be a very, very expensive shooting star.
Exactly. But tungsten has the highest melting point of any pure metal on the periodic table. It melts at over 6,100 degrees Fahrenheit. That extreme thermal resilience allows it to survive the violent descent through the atmosphere completely intact, so it arrives at the target on the surface of the Earth with the exact same mass and aerodynamic profile it had when it left the orbital platform.
So let's walk through what actually happens when you pull the trigger. We have a satellite in low Earth orbit. It drops a 24,000-pound solid metal telephone pole. Gravity takes over, it falls through the atmosphere, and by the time it reaches the ground, the text says it is traveling at Mach 10.
Right.
That is 10 times the speed of sound. And here's where I need you to really break down the math for me, because Enfield brings up a first-year college physics equation that somehow takes a metal pole with absolutely zero explosives in it and turns it into a weapon of mass destruction.
The underlying physics relies entirely on the equation for kinetic energy, which is Ke equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared.
Ke equals 1/2 mv squared.
Exactly. It is a formula most people encounter in high school physics when they're, calculating the energy of a rolling bowling ball or a moving car. But when you apply that simple equation to the extreme variables of orbital mechanics, the results become absolutely catastrophic.
This is the velocity, right?
Precisely. The mass is certainly large. I mean, 12,000 kilograms is very heavy. But in that equation, the velocity is the dominant variable because it is squared. So the energy outbound doesn't just increase as it gets faster, it scales exponentially. When an object that heavy hits the Earth's crust at Mach 10, the velocity term in that equation produces a kinetic energy yield upon impact that is equivalent to 11.5 tons of TNT.
11.5 tons of TNT. I mean, let that sink in for a second. A solid metal pole, completely inert, no gunpowder, no nuclear material, no chemical explosives whatsoever, just a really heavy rock falling really fast, and it hits with the force of an 11-ton bomb.
It is a purely kinetic impact. All of that forward momentum is instantaneously converted into heat and shockwave energy the millisecond it meets the physical resistance of the Earth. And this gives the rod from God a deeply unique and, frankly, deeply troubling strategic profile. Enfield calls it a clean weapon.
Clean.
Yes, it delivers the concentrated, pinpoint destructive output of a tactical nuclear warhead, but it produces absolutely zero radioactive fallout.
Wow, so there's no radiation at all?
None. There's no half-life to worry about. The crater it leaves behind doesn't glow in the dark. It doesn't poison the local groundwater or carry toxic dust on the wind to neighboring countries. It just instantly, violently, and utterly ceases the existence of whatever it happens to hit.
But, dropping a giant heavy nail from space does come with some physical limitations, right? Enfield spends a good portion of the first essay talking about what he calls the penetration problem.
Yep.
And it makes sense if you think about it. Like if I take a normal smooth iron nail and I try to hammer it into a thick block of wood, the first inch goes in really easy. But as I drive it deeper, the wood is squeezing tight against the sides of the nail. The friction builds up, and eventually, no matter how hard I hit it, that shaft friction stops the nail from going any deeper.
That is a perfect analogy for what military engineers call the problem of symmetric penetrators. See, when a perfectly symmetrical cylindrical tungsten rod hits the ground at Mach 10, the extreme localized pressure literally liquefies the rock, the dirt, and the reinforced concrete directly in front of it. It turns the Earth into this superheated plasma-like material.
Just from the sheer pressure.
Just from the pressure. And the rod flows through this liquid rock very easily at first. But as it pushes dozens of feet deeper, the walls of the channel it just created begin to cool and collapse back inward, pressing against the entire 20-foot length of the rod's body.
So it's grabbing the rod.
Exactly. The surface area experiencing friction is immense. This shaft friction rapidly bleeds off the kinetic energy, acting like a giant geological brake, and the rod just stops long before it reaches the deepest military bunkers.
Right. So if your goal is to destroy a command center that is buried hundreds of feet under a granite mountain, a giant smooth nail just isn't going to cut it. It'll get stuck halfway down. So how does Enfield suggest this is actually solved? He introduces what sounds like a massive engineering upgrade to the rod, something about an offset nose weight.
Yes. And this is a brilliant, genuinely terrifying piece of applied physics. The engineers don't change the shape of the rod on the outside, but inside the nose of the cylinder, they shift a small amount of the tungsten's weight slightly off axis. So the center of mass is no longer perfectly aligned right down the middle of the pole.
Okay, so it's a little lopsided internally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then, when the orbital platform is ready to fire, it doesn't just drop the rod. It fires it out of an electromagnetic railgun that spins the rod on its long axis at several thousand revolutions per minute.
Like the rifling in a gun barrel spinning a bullet so it flies straight.
Exactly like rifling, but with a crucial twist. Because the weight in the nose is intentionally off-center, the gyroscopic physics of the rod change dramatically as it falls. It doesn't just spin perfectly straight like a perfectly thrown football spiral. That off-center weight causes the nose to precess. As it spins, the nose traces a tight, continuous, highly energetic circle. It actually begins to carve a cone shape in the air as it descends.
Wait, I get it. So if I have a normal nail, it gets stuck because the shaft rubs against the wood. But if I use a drill bit, the tip of the bit is carving a hole that is slightly wider than the actual smooth shaft of the drill itself.
Yeah.
You've turned the weapon from a nail into a drill bit.
That is exactly the physical mechanism. Because the precessing spinning nose is tracing a circle, it bores a physical hole into the mountain that is slightly wider than the actual 12-inch diameter of the tungsten pole. Because the hole is wider than the body of the rod, the entire 20-foot shaft never actually touches the walls of the rock channel it is creating. You have completely mathematically eliminated shaft friction from the equation. The only physical resistance the weapon experiences is at the very tip of the spinning nose.
And without that friction slowing it down.
The penetration depth doesn't just increase by a few percent, it becomes multiplicative. It allows the rod to maintain its kinetic energy far, far deeper into the earth, liquefying reinforced concrete and penetrating hundreds of feet through solid rock.
Enfield also mentions that this spinning drill bit motion solves another major issue, the oblique entry problem. Because, as he points out, mountains aren't perfectly flat on top.
Right.
If you drop a normal symmetric nail straight down onto a steeply sloped piece of wood, the nail doesn't go straight in. The angle causes it to glance off. It deflects sideways.
Yes, it's a problem of asymmetrical force. A standard rod hitting a sloped mountainside will experience more resistance on the uphill side than the downhill side, which pushes the tail of the rod over, deflecting its path entirely away from the bunker below.
But the spin fixes that.
Completely. This spinning, precessing offset nose acts exactly like the threads of a screw. When you drive a screw into an angled piece of wood, it doesn't deflect. The rapid circular cutting action distributes the lateral forces perfectly evenly around the bore path. The rod basically threads itself flawlessly straight into the mountain, self-correcting its own trajectory regardless of the surface geometry.
It just turns the mountain into butter. A perfectly straight, incredibly deep hole, meaning this weapon can reach the absolute deepest command facilities any nation on Earth possesses. It reaches the caves. It reaches the places where the leaders hide.
It reaches depths that even the absolute most advanced, specialized nuclear Earth-penetrating bombs cannot reliably destroy.
Okay, let's step back for a second. Because if this physics relies on an equation I learned when I was 16, and the basic concept has been around in science fiction since, like, the Eisenhower administration, why are we only facing this terrifying reality right now in 2026? Why isn't the sky already full of these things?
Because until very, very recently, there were two massive, seemingly insurmountable barriers standing in the way of Project Thor. One was money, and the other was international law. And Enfield dedicates the second essay entirely to explaining how, in the last few years, both of those barriers have utterly and completely collapsed.
Let's start with the money barrier, because the cost comparisons Enfield lays out are just mind-blowing. Historically, putting anything heavy into space was prohibitively, almost comically expensive.
Right. During the era of the space shuttle, the cost to put a payload into low Earth orbit was approximately $54,000 per kilogram.
$54,000 for 1 kilo.
Yes. So to launch just one 12,000-kilogram tungsten rod would have cost nearly $650 million. If you wanted a full orbital platform with a magazine of 6 rods, plus the solar power systems, the targeting sensors, and the electromagnetic railgun to spin them, you were looking at a project cost of $4 to $5 billion per satellite.
Yeah, so it was an interesting thought experiment, but it was just a Cold War fantasy. It was simply too expensive, even for the blank check budget of the Pentagon.
Exactly. But then the commercial space industry arrives. SpaceX completely changes the paradigm, first with the Falcon 9, then the Falcon Heavy, proving that you can actually land and reuse the booster rockets. Costs drop from $54,000 a kilo down to around $1,400.
Which is a huge drop. But Enfield says the real nail in the coffin, the ultimate game changer, is the Starship platform. Fully reusable, rapid turnaround, massive payload capacity.
The projections Enfield cites for Starship, assuming it is operating with high reusability in this current 2026 timeframe, drive launch costs down to an astonishing $10 to $32 per kilogram.
That is insane.
It is a cost reduction of over 5,000 times compared to the space shuttle. Space is no longer a premium real estate market. It is cheap, accessible cargo transport.
And when you apply that new, cheap cargo math to a weapons system like the rods from God. The numbers are genuinely arresting. Enfield breaks it down line by line. He notes that the tungsten itself is incredibly cheap. It's an industrial metal, running about $50 a kilo on the open market. So, to manufacture 6 of these 10-ton rods only costs about $3 million. To launch all of them on a Starship flight costs maybe $6 million.
Right. The only truly expensive part is building the satellite bus itself, the railgun, and the nuclear battery to power the spin, which runs about $200 million.
Which brings the total all-in cost of a fully operational, permanently armed orbital kinetic strike platform to somewhere between $210 million and $250 million.
Which is nothing in military terms.
I mean, that is the price of just 2.5 F-35 fighter jets. And the comparison Enfield makes between an F-35 and a tungsten rod really puts the danger into perspective for the listener.
Because, as Enfield rightly points out, you aren't just comparing the sticker price. You are comparing mortality and reliability. An F-35 cost roughly $83 million. But an F-35 is a fragile, highly complex machine. It can be shot down by a lucky surface-to-air missile.
Right.
Its radar and communications can be jammed by advanced electronic warfare. It can be grounded because a storm rolls in, or because a mechanic found a tiny crack in a turbine blade. Furthermore, an F-35 can only operate in one specific geographic theater at a time. Defeating an F-35 is the entire focus of a massive global defense industry.
But the tungsten rod, it has no human pilot inside to kill.
Right.
It has no highly volatile jet fuel to catch fire and explode. Once it is released from the platform, it has no onboard computers, no GPS, no electronics whatsoever to jam or hack.
None.
It doesn't care if there's a Category 5 hurricane over the target.
Yeah.
And because it is in orbit, traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, it operates over every single military theater on Earth simultaneously, 24 hours a day. And the most terrifying part, you can't shoot it down. I mean, if I'm a general on the ground and I see this Mach 10 telephone pole coming at my bunker and I fire my absolute best, most advanced interceptor missile at it and I actually score a direct hit, what actually happens?
You don't neutralize the threat. Think about the physics. You have just hit a solid mass of extremely dense metal traveling at 10 times the speed of sound. You might fracture it, you might break it into a dozen large pieces, but you haven't stopped its forward momentum.
It's still coming.
You have simply turned one massive, precise kinetic impactor into a hypersonic shotgun blast of jagged tungsten fragments that is still going to blanket the exact same target area. In fact, by breaking it up, you've likely widened the area of destruction, creating even more unpredictable, catastrophic damage to soft targets on the surface. It is, for all practical intents and purposes, an unkillable weapon.
Okay, so the economic barrier is completely gone. At $250 million, literally any nation with the budget of a mid-sized corporation can afford to build one. But what about the law? I mean, surely we realized this was a possibility decades ago. Isn't there an international treaty against putting weapons of mass destruction in space?
This brings us exactly to the second collapse Enfield discusses. The legal vacuum. The foundational bedrock of international space law is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It was drafted during the height of the Cold War, largely in the terrified aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right, everyone was on edge.
The global community wanted to prevent the specific existential terror of that era, which was the fear of the Soviets or the Americans putting nuclear weapons in orbit, just permanently hanging over everyone's heads.
Right, Article 4 of the treaty, I looked it up before we started. It explicitly prohibits placing nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth. So, case closed, right?
Not in the eyes of international lawyers, where words have incredibly precise, legally binding definitions. Think about it. A solid tungsten cylinder contains absolutely no enriched uranium or plutonium. It contains no biological pathogens. It contains no chemical explosives or nerve agents. Legally speaking, it does not meet the definition of a weapon of mass destruction.
Wow, so vegan.
It is legally just a rock.
Oh.
It is a mass. And the electromagnetic railgun on the satellite that spins and launches it, under international space law, that is simply classified as a propulsion system or a payload deployment mechanism. The Outer Space Treaty says absolutely nothing about dropping a solid, non-explosive metal pole from orbit. It is a legal loophole the exact size of a telephone pole.
And the timing of this, which is why Enfield is writing this right now in 2026, is what makes this moment so incredibly dangerous. Because it isn't just that someone found a clever loophole in a treaty from the 1960s, it's that we just lost the primary safety net we had down here on the ground.
You're referring to the expiration of the New START Treaty. On February 5, 2026, The last remaining nuclear arms control pact between the United States and Russia officially expired. For 50 years, through various iterations of START treaties, the major nuclear powers had a legally binding verification architecture. We could physically inspect each other's nuclear arsenals, we had transparency regarding delivery systems.
And now?
As of last month, that architecture is entirely gone. For the first time in half a century, there is absolutely no treaty constraining the arms race between the world's major powers.
And right into that dark, totally unmonitored vacuum steps this new, incredibly cheap, legally ambiguous, unstoppable orbital weapon, which creates a strategic nightmare that Enfield says fundamentally breaks the modern world order. To illustrate this, the text talks about Operation Midnight Hammer, an event from June 2025. What exactly happened there, and why does Enfield focus on it so much?
Operation Midnight Hammer was a targeted U.S. military strike on Iran's highly fortified nuclear facilities at Fordo, occurring during a brief but intense 12-day conflict. To destroy that specific bunker, the U.S. had to utilize its absolute most powerful conventional Earth-penetrating weapon, which is the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, commonly known as the MOP.
And this thing is an absolute monster.
It is a leviathan of a bomb. It weighs 30,000 pounds. It is entirely designed to crack deep bunkers. But Fordo was buried under a mountain. To reach the actual facility, which intelligence estimated was 80 to 90 meters underground, dropping one MOP wasn't enough.
Just one didn't do it.
No. The U.S. Air Force had to drop 14 of these 30,000-pound bombs, perfectly sequenced, one after another, guiding them exactly down the same narrow ventilation shafts, using the previous bomb's crater to dig slightly deeper for the next one.
Which is an unbelievable feat of engineering and precision. And it worked, right? They destroyed the facility. But Enfield says it ultimately proved a fatal point about conventional warfare.
Exactly. It proved that 80 to 90 meters is the absolute ragged edge limit of conventional Earth-penetrating weapons. You cannot build a conventional bomb much bigger than the MOP and still be able to carry it on an airplane. And the adversary's response to Operation Midnight Hammer wasn't to throw up their hands and surrender their nuclear ambitions.
No, of course not.
Their response was simple geology. They just started digging deeper. Within months, satellite imagery showed Iran constructing a massive new facility at a location called Pickaxe Mountain, deliberately tunneling down to 100 meters, just mathematically out of the reach of the MOP.
They figured out the exact length of our longest sword, and they built their shield 1 inch thicker. But that 100-meter depth is absolutely not out of reach of a spinning Mach 10 tungsten rod from space. And this, Enfield argues, is where the entire concept of nuclear deterrence just loses its foundational premise.
If we look at the last 70 years of geopolitical history, the nuclear peace between superpowers has held because of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MANA, and MAD completely relies on the concept of the second strike. The foundational idea is that no matter how hard or how suddenly an adversary hits you in a surprise first strike, your command structure, your leadership, and your retaliatory weapons, which are hidden in immensely deep granite-covered bunkers, will survive the blast. Because they survive, they can launch a devastating counterattack. Because the adversary knows they will be utterly destroyed in return, they are deterred from launching the first strike to begin with. Survivability equals peace.
But the rod changes the math entirely. If a spinning tungsten drill falling from orbit can effortlessly penetrate hundreds of feet of solid granite, it doesn't matter how deep your bunker is. It doesn't matter if it's Pickaxe Mountain. It doesn't matter if it's the U.S. facility at Cheyenne Mountain, or the Raven Rock Complex, or the massive Russian deep command facilities in the Urals. Every single one of them is suddenly completely vulnerable.
Enfield terms this the decapitation problem. For the first time in the entire nuclear age, there is a highly plausible, relatively cheap, purely conventional pathway to completely eliminate an adversary's command and control authority in a sudden first strike.
And it's conventional.
Exactly. And crucially, it is a strike that produces no radioactive fallout, no EMP, and no mushroom cloud. It significantly lowers the psychological threshold for using it. It fundamentally destabilizes the assumption of survivability that has kept the world safe since 1945.
And Enfield points out an even bigger, arguably more terrifying problem: the attribution problem. Think about how deterrence works today. If an adversary launches an intercontinental ballistic missile at us, our early warning satellites detect the massive, blazing thermal plume of the rocket engine the absolute second it ignites.
Right.
We know exactly who fired it, from which silo or submarine, and we have anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes to track its arc, confirm the threat, and launch our retaliation before the missile hits. But how do you detect a rod from God?
The terrifying answer is that you almost can't. The orbital platform has been floating in low Earth orbit for months or even years, looking on radar exactly like any of the other 12,000 active commercial or communication satellites currently up there. When the order is given to strike, there is no massive rocket ignition, there is no glaring thermal plume.
It's just a push.
The electromagnetic railgun simply spins the rod up and pushes it out of the bay. A tiny, nearly invisible thruster burn provides just enough drag to slow it down and pull it out of orbit. In the vacuum of space, it is a completely silent, essentially invisible launch.
It's just a cold piece of metal falling in the dark.
Yeah.
Until it hits the top of the atmosphere. And by the time the friction heats it up enough for ground-based early warning radar to finally detect this telephone pole screaming through the sky at Mach 10, Enfield does the math. You have exactly 11 seconds.
Yes.
11 seconds from the moment alarms go off until catastrophic impact.
And this is the scenario that keeps strategists awake at night. Deterrence absolutely requires knowing who to retaliate against. If your primary deep command bunker is utterly destroyed in a silent 11-second strike, and your satellites saw no launch plume, who do you shoot back at? It could have been a Russian platform, it could have been Chinese. But under the new collapsed economics of space launch, it could have been a heavily funded private military contractor. It could have been a rogue sovereign wealth fund acting on its own. If you don't know who dropped the rod, you can't retaliate. And if you can't retaliate, the entire architecture of global deterrence completely unravels.
Okay. We've established that the ultimate offensive weapon is cheap, it bypasses international law, and it cannot be intercepted or survived by traditional means. It's a really bleak picture. But warfare is never static. It is a constant, evolving push and pull between offense and defense. Right now, on the ground, we are seeing traditional offensive systems being completely overwhelmed. How does a nation defend its perimeter in this new reality? This is where Enfield pivots his essays from the offensive nightmare to a defensive counterpart, a system he calls Michael.
Yes, the defensive complement to the unstoppable offensive weapon. And to truly understand why Michael was developed, Enfield asks us to look closely at what he calls the math of exhaustion.
I found his framing here really compelling. He uses the biblical story of David and Goliath. We all know the story. David is the underdog. He has a sling and a few smooth stones. And he defeats the giant, heavily armored Goliath with a single precise shot. But Enfield asks us a really great question. What if Goliath hadn't shown up alone?
Right.
What if Goliath had brought 2,000 heavily armed friends? David only had a few stones. He would have been overrun instantly. Modern missile defense systems like the U.S. Patriot batteries or Israel's Iron Dome are essentially David's sling. They rely on point defense. One highly advanced, incredibly expensive interceptor missile is fired to destroy one incoming threat. What happens when the magazine runs dry?
That is the exact strategic crisis that played out in the February 2026 Middle East conflict, which we noted at the top of the hour. In that massive barrage, the attacking forces didn't rely on a few high-end, expensive weapons. They utilized a strategy of mass. They fired thousands of cheap, commercially available drones alongside their ballistic missiles.
Swarm tactics.
Exactly. If you are a commander defending a base and you are forced to fire a $4 million Patriot missile to intercept a drone that cost the enemy $2,000 to build, you aren't just losing a tactical military engagement, you are experiencing a real-time economic collapse. The attacker's goal in 2026 isn't necessarily to destroy the target with the first wave. The goal is to empty your magazine, to force you to spend yourself into total vulnerability so the second wave can fly in unopposed.
Right. The attacker uses cheap mass. The defender is forced to use expensive precision. It is an utterly losing game for the defender. So the solution Enfield introduces is the system called Michael. It's spelled M-I-C-A-H-L, which, as the text notes, is a play on the Hebrew name Mikael, meaning who is like God, referencing the archangel Michael, the ultimate defender. And instead of firing expensive physical interceptor missiles, Michael fires something else entirely, acoustic pressure waves.
The doctrine is called acoustic area denial. It is a brilliant lateral inversion of the defensive problem. And Enfield points out that it relies on a very rich, highly successful historical precedent from the Cold War, right?
Yes. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy had to figure out how to track Soviet nuclear submarines across the vastness of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. They built SOSUS, the sound surveillance system. It was an incredibly vast array of underwater hydrophones lying on the ocean floor that could detect and track the acoustic signatures of submarines from hundreds of miles away. They realized that the ocean wasn't just water, it was a medium of disclosure. Sound travels incredibly well through fluid mediums.
And the text also brings up the history of acoustic naval mines, which I didn't actually know much about. Apparently, these are mines sitting on the seafloor that don't need a ship to physically bump into them to explode. They just sit there and listen. When they hear the specific acoustic profile of an enemy ship's propellers, the exact right frequency and volume, they detonate.
Right.
And to counter that, navies use minesweeping helicopters that tow large devices through the water, purposefully mimicking those exact engine sounds, trying to trick the mines into exploding early, safely away from the real ships. Exactly. Michael takes that exact principle, the use of intense acoustic energy for physical disruption and deception, and scales it up from a single naval mine to an entire impenetrable defensive perimeter. It projects a continuous wall of high-intensity acoustic energy into the air around a base or into the water if defending a port. And Enfield details how this invisible wall defeats incoming threats through 3 distinct, fascinating physical mechanisms.
Let's really sandbox these mechanisms because the physics here are wild. Mechanism number 1, proximity fuse deception.
To understand this, you have to understand how modern warheads work. Most advanced missiles, glide vehicles, and even loitering drones don't actually wait for physical impact to detonate. If a missile hits the dirt and then explodes, a lot of its energy is wasted digging a crater.
That makes sense.
Instead, they use proximity fuses. These are tiny radar, laser, or acoustic sensors on the nose of the weapon that constantly measure the distance to the ground. When they detect that they are, say, 30 feet away from a solid surface, they trigger the warhead to airburst, which maximizes the destructive spread of the shrapnel and the shock wave over the target.
Right, so they were flying along looking for a sudden drastic change in the density of the air or a solid radar reflection to tell their computer brain, hey, we are about to hit a building, time to detonate.
Precisely. Now, when the Michael system projects its wall of high-amplitude acoustic pressure into the sky, it is literally compressing the air. It creates zones of extreme density variations. When an incoming weapon traveling at high speed flies into that acoustic wall, its proximity fuse sensors are suddenly overwhelmed by this massive spike in pressure and density.
Oh, wow.
To the weapon's computer, that acoustic pressure wave looks and feels exactly like a solid surface. The fuse thinks it has arrived at the target, it triggers the warhead, and the weapon detonates in empty air miles away from the base it was trying to destroy.
That is incredible. You haven't shot it down with a missile. You haven't fired a single bullet. You have just tricked its own onboard intelligence into killing itself early.
It's using the enemy's own sophistication against them.
Okay, mechanism number 2, boundary layer destabilization. Enfield notes this is specifically designed to counter those high-end, utterly terrifying hypersonic glide vehicles that Russia and China have been developing.
Hypersonic flight, which is generally defined as anything traveling above Mach 5, is an incredibly fragile state of physics. It relies entirely on maintaining what aerodynamicists call the boundary layer.
The boundary layer?
Yes, that is the microscopically thin layer of air right against the physical skin of the vehicle. At Mach 5 and above, the friction is so intense that the air around the vehicle literally turns into a superheated plasma. The boundary layer is managing immense thermal and aerodynamic stress, keeping that plasma flowing smoothly over the craft so it doesn't burn up or lose control. It is a highly delicate physical balancing act.
It makes me think of trying to drive a high-performance race car at 200 miles an hour on a track made of sheer ice. As long as you keep the steering wheel perfectly straight and the aerodynamics push you down, you're fine. But if you hit even a tiny bump, or disrupt the airflow over the spoiler even a little bit, you lose traction, and the car instantly violently spins out.
That is a perfect analogy. The acoustic wall of Michael acts like a series of massive invisible potholes on that track of ice. When a hypersonic glide vehicle hits that wall of sound, the intense pressure variations violently disrupt that smooth, delicate boundary layer. Suddenly, the plasma flow becomes turbulent.
And it spins out.
Furthermore, the acoustic energy induces structural resonance. The intense sound waves literally vibrate the airframe of the missile at its natural frequency. Between the turbulent boundary layer and the physical vibration, the vehicle instantly loses its aerodynamic stability. It tumbles. And at Mach 5, if a vehicle tumbles, the sheer aerodynamic forces instantly tear it apart. It shreds itself into confetti. Again, you didn't intercept it with a physical object. You just made the air itself hostile to its flight envelope.
And then we get to the third mechanism, which Enfield says finally solves the David and Goliath problem we talked about earlier. He calls it the meat grinder effect.
This is Michael's definitive answer to the drone swarm. As we discussed, a Patriot battery commander cares deeply if radar shows 50 drones incoming, because that commander has to allocate and fire 50 highly expensive missiles to stop them. The acoustic wall generated by Michael does not care.
It just doesn't care.
It is not a point defense system. It is an area denial system. It is painting a continuous, massive volume of air with lethal acoustic pressure. Whether a single solitary drone flies into that volume or a swarm of 2,000 drones flies into it simultaneously, the wall treats them all exactly the same. The intense sound waves simply rattle the cheap plastic and metal components of the drones until their rotors snap and their circuit boards shatter.
It's the difference between a sniper trying to shoot a swarm of angry bees out of the air one by one with a rifle versus just hanging up a giant glowing bug zapper. The bug zapper doesn't care how many bees there are. If they touch the grid, they fry.
Exactly. Michael fundamentally breaks the arithmetic of swarm warfare. The cost and effort of defending a base no longer scales linearly with the number of threats the enemy launches. The swarm becomes mathematically irrelevant.
But there is a massive catch here, isn't there? I mean, to power a giant invisible wall of sound that can shatter metal drones, trick missile fuses, and vibrate hypersonic vehicles to death, you need an unbelievable, almost science fiction amount of electrical energy. You can't just plug this thing into a diesel generator or a lithium-ion battery.
Which is why Enfield spends a significant amount of time detailing the power architecture. It is the beating heart of the Michael system. The system utilizes compact fission reactors, specifically designs modeled on the kilopower units originally engineered by NASA for deep space missions or Mars colonies, or large-scale radioisotope thermoelectric generators, RTGs.
Okay, nuclear batteries.
Yes. These are self-contained nuclear batteries that can provide continuous, highly reliable, maintenance-free power for years or even decades without ever needing refueling.
Well, wait, if I understand reactors correctly, they provide a steady, continuous baseline of power, right? A reactor can't suddenly output a massive gigawatt spike of energy in the 11 seconds you have to stop a hypersonic strike. It takes time to spin up turbines.
You are absolutely right, which is why the reactor is only the first step in the power architecture. The system uses a massive intermediate capacitor layer. The nuclear reactor's job isn't to directly power the acoustic blast. The reactor's job is to sit there, day and night, constantly trickling power into a massive bank of ultracapacitors.
Oh, like a sponge.
Exactly. Capacitors are essentially energy sponges that can store a huge amount of electrical charge and then release it almost instantly. When the early warning radar detects an incoming threat, those capacitors discharge their stored energy in a matter of microseconds into a 360-degree phase transducer array, generating the massive acoustic wall.
Which means the magazine is completely bottomless.
As long as the reactor is running, yes.
Yeah.
A Patriot battery fires a physical missile, and then that launch tube is permanently empty until a supply truck arrives to reload it. Michael fires invisible joules of energy. And while the first wave of enemy drones is being destroyed by the acoustic wall, the nuclear reactor is already furiously pumping energy back into the capacitors, recharging them for the second wave.
That's incredible.
It completely rewrites the fundamental exchange rate of warfare. It shifts the paradigm from interceptors per target, which bankrupts the defender, to joules per engagement, where the defender has essentially infinite ammunition. As Enfield concludes, it is a total environmental defense system. It works in the sky against missiles, and if deployed underwater around a harbor, the exact same acoustic principles will shatter incoming torpedoes and prematurely detonate naval mines.
Okay. We have spent a long time exploring the dark side of this technology. The ultimate offensive weapon falling from the sky and the ultimate defensive shield reshaping the battlefield. But here is where Enfield's essays take a breathtaking, almost dizzying pivot. He asks a profound question. What if this exact same physics, all of this terrifying, planet-shaking power we've just described, is not actually meant for war?
Right.
What if the ultimate application of these tools is to bring a dead world to life? Here's where it gets really interesting.
This is the dual-use problem, and it brings us to Enfield's third essay, which details what he calls the Centennial Collapse model for the terraforming of the planet Venus.
I read this essay 3 times because it is just so incredibly ambitious. The author states that the physics of total destruction and the physics of planetary creation are exactly the same thing. They're just pointed in different directions. And he proposes a highly detailed, deeply researched plan to terraform Venus. which is arguably the most hostile, hellish planet in the entire solar system. And he claims we can do it not in 10,000 years, but in just 100 years.
To understand how a 100-year timeline is even theoretically possible, we have to shift our perspective. We have to look at Venus not as a mechanical problem to be solved with slow brute force engineering, but as a thermodynamic system. Let's look at the current state of Venus.
That's awful.
It really is. It has an atmosphere that is 92 times thicker and heavier than Earth's. It is made almost entirely of choking carbon dioxide. It is wrapped in clouds of sulfuric acid, and the surface temperatures hover around 450 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. It is a stable system. It has been like that for billions of years. But, as Enfield points out, thermodynamic stability is not the same thing as permanence.
Right. Think about an avalanche. A mountainside full of snow is perfectly stable. It just sits there.
Yeah.
But it's holding an immense amount of potential energy. If you push that stable system hard enough, if you perturb it past a very specific tipping point, like a loud noise or a skier cutting across the slope, the stability shatters. The system collapses into a massive, violent cascade, and it eventually settles into a completely new, lower energy state at the bottom of the mountain.
That is the exact principle of the centennial collapse model. The core insight is that you don't use brute force to slowly scoop the atmosphere of Venus out into space. That would take millennia. Instead, you use a coordinated symphony of 6 massive integrated engineering systems to violently perturb the planet past its threshold. You trigger the avalanche. And once the cascade begins, the planet's own immense thermodynamic feedback loops do the rest of the heavy lifting. The systems are multiplicative, not additive. They amplify each other's effects in a runaway chain reaction.
I want to walk through these 6 systems in detail for the listener because Enfield lays it out like an absolute masterclass in planetary engineering. System 1. Orbital mirrors.
This is the primary continuous catalyst. The plan calls for deploying a massive array of hundreds of thousands of ultra-thin, lightweight mirrors at the Venus L1 Lagrange point, the point in space between the sun and the planet where gravity balances out.
Okay, so they just float there.
Exactly. You use these mirrors to completely block the sunlight hitting one of the poles of Venus, casting it into permanent, deep shadow. This creates an artificial cold trap, dropping the temperature so low that the carbon dioxide atmosphere actually begins to freeze and snow out as dry ice. Simultaneously, you use a different magnifying array of mirrors to focus incredibly intense concentrated sunlight onto the exact opposite pole, superheating that region to over 2,000 degrees Celsius.
So you have one pole that is freezing solid and one pole that is literally boiling rock. That creates a 1,500-degree temperature gradient across the planet. What does that actually do to the atmosphere?
It creates an unimaginably massive pressure gradient. The hot air rapidly expands and rushes violently toward the cold, low-pressure pole. We are talking about generating continuous, unrelenting winds traveling at 500 meters per second.
500 meters per second.
Yes. It creates a permanent, far-from-equilibrium dynamic. It ensures the incredibly dense atmosphere is constantly churning, violently mixing, never allowed to settle. And that chaotic mixing makes every other system we are about to deploy exponentially more effective.
Which brings us to System 2. Ultra-high-yield nuclear devices. Now, I have to be honest, when I first read this section, I had to stop and reread it. Wait, we are actively dropping nuclear bombs on a planet in order to save it.
Yes, and we aren't talking about the tactical warheads used in modern arsenals. Enfield proposes scaling up the classic Teller-Ulam staged fusion designs originally developed in the 1950s. He envisions creating 10 gigaton, 100 gigaton, and eventually 1 teraton devices.
Wait, a teraton, like with a T?
Exactly, with a T. Let's give that some context. Enfield compares a single teraton device to the Chicxulub asteroid impact, the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs and cracked the Earth's crust. A teraton bomb is roughly 1/10 of that entire apocalyptic energy released in a single manufactured weapon.
Why on Earth, or why on Venus, would you ever unleash that level of violence?
Well, you don't detonate them on the surface. You detonate them high up in the middle atmosphere. And you aren't doing it to try and directly blast the atmosphere off into space. Even a teraton bomb isn't big enough to do that. You do it to create what Enfield calls scalable earthquakes in the air. Because the atmosphere on Venus is 92 times thicker than Earth's, it doesn't behave like thin air. It behaves more like a thick fluid, like an ocean.
Oh, I see.
When a teraton device detonates in that fluid, it sends a hemispheric pressure shockwave of unimaginable force circling the entire globe.
Like dropping a boulder into a pond?
Exactly. The thermal heat and the pressure shockwave trigger massive artificial convective storms. It violently pushes billions of tons of the atmospheric mass up to incredibly high altitudes, right to the edge of space, where it is much easier for solar winds to strip it away. The continuous sequence of these nuclear blasts provides the violent perturbation that prevents the planet from ever settling back into its stable equilibrium. You are constantly shaking the snow globe.
Which perfectly sets the stage for System 3, kinetic bombardment, which is exactly what we spent the first 20 minutes of this deep dive talking about, the rods from God, the exact same tungsten telephone poles designed to wipe out deep military bunkers. But here, Enfield says, they aren't aiming at a command center.
No, they are acting as a planetary-scale orbital plow. The current surface of Venus is very old and heavily weathered. It doesn't chemically react with the thick carbon dioxide atmosphere anymore. But if you drop millions of these 4-ton spinning tungsten rods from orbit, the kinetic impacts deeply excavate the crust. They violently throw up massive plumes of fresh, unweathered calcium and magnesium silicate rock from deep underground.
And I remember my high school chemistry. That fresh rock acts like a chemical sponge for carbon.
Precisely. The moment that fresh silicate dust is exposed to the atmosphere, it chemically reacts with the CO2. It binds with it, locking the carbon dioxide away as solid carbonates that fall back to the surface as rock.
Wow.
And because the orbital mirrors have generated those 500 meter per second winds, the atmosphere is constantly violently circulating over these fresh impact craters, massively accelerating the chemical sequestration. The rods are quite literally tilling the soil of the planet, planting carbon instead of seeds.
Then Enfield introduces System 4, high-energy lasers. We deploy massive arrays of nuclear-powered free electron lasers in orbit, and we just fire them continuously down into the swirling Venusian clouds.
The lasers provide what is known as photochemical activation. The carbon dioxide molecule, CO2, is incredibly stable. It wants to stay CO2 forever. But if you hit that molecule with a very specific, highly tuned 4.3 micrometer laser wavelength, it hits the molecule's resonant frequency. The molecule absorbs so much energy that it violently vibrates and forcibly dissociates. You snap the bonds, breaking the CO2 apart into carbon monoxide and highly reactive oxygen radicals.
So you're using light to literally chop the molecules into pieces. It's like a singer hitting the exact right pitch to shatter a wine glass, but on a planetary molecular scale.
That's a great way to visualize it. And in a normal environment, those pieces would just recombine back into CO2 a moment later. But remember, they are doing this in a highly chaotic, violently turbulent environment created by the nuclear blasts and the kinetic impacts. In that high-energy state, those oxygen radicals don't just snap back together. They participate in complex, new chemical pathways that are normally impossible, creating entirely new compounds that are either easier to vent into space or easier to freeze at the dark pole.
And finally, we arrive at System 5, acoustic resonance. And this is where my jaw just totally hit the floor. Enfield proposes using the exact same acoustic technology as the Michael Defense Shield, but instead of protecting a military base from drones, it is organizing the atmosphere of an entire planet.
Yes. The orbital acoustic arrays beam extremely low-frequency, high-amplitude pressure waves deep into the thick Venusian atmosphere. By carefully tuning the frequency, they drive the entire atmosphere at its natural resonant frequencies. This creates planetary-scale standing waves.
Enfield uses this beautiful phrase. He calls it shepherding the chaos. Because the nuclear bombs, the mirror-driven winds, and the lasers have created all this violent, turbulent, undirected energy. It's a total mess. But the acoustic standing waves organize that mess. They create invisible, rigid structures in the air giant, permanent columns of upwelling pressure that act like enormous chimneys, funneling the turbulent atmospheric mass directly upwards, accelerating its escape into space.
The acoustic system is the conductor of the terraforming symphony. Without the standing waves, the energy from the nukes and the winds just dissipates randomly around the globe. With the standing waves, all of that energy is strictly organized and focused toward one goal: atmospheric escape.
So you turn on the mirrors, you drop the nukes, you drop the rods, you fire the lasers, and you blast the standing waves. You run all these systems simultaneously. And the timeline Enfield lays out is just 100 years. He points out that year 30 is the critical inflection point. That's the moment the avalanche truly begins. That is when the cascade takes over. You can actually stop pushing the planet, and the planet's own new feedback loops start pulling it toward its new state. By year 100, the surface temperature drops from a lead-melting 450 degrees Celsius down to a manageable 320 degrees. The atmospheric pressure drops by 45%. Now, it's not Earth yet. You can't take your helmet off and breathe. But the runaway greenhouse effect is permanently broken. The planet is open for the next biological phase of terraforming.
And perhaps the most profound part of Enfield's entire argument isn't even the physics, it's the budget. He calculates that to build, launch, and operate this entire massive six-system symphony would cost roughly $100 billion a year.
Which sounds like an astronomical amount of money. Until you realize that $100 billion is only about 0.1% of the total global GDP.
Exactly. It is roughly what the United States currently spends every single year just maintaining, upgrading, and securing its existing nuclear weapons arsenal. Enfield makes a piercing, undeniable observation. The exact same financial resources, the exact same industrial capacity, and the exact same physical hardware that we currently use to maintain the tools of civilizational destruction could instead literally build a new, living world next door. The resources exist today, the physics is proven today, the hardware is being launched today.
Which brings us to the profound philosophical core of these three essays, bringing the unstoppable offensive weapon, the impenetrable defensive shield, and the planet-shaping terraforming frameworks all together into one unified theory of human power.
Enfield frames this final synthesis through deep, ancient theological metaphors. He returns to the image of the bunker. In the book of Revelation, chapter 6, there is a passage describing the apocalypse. It describes the kings of the earth, the generals, the rich, and the mighty hiding themselves in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They are terrified, and they beg the mountains and the rocks to fall on them, to hide them from the wrath that is coming.
It's the ultimate description of the bunker mentality. They built deep bunkers. They thought the mass of the mountain was their ultimate shield. But the kinetic rod, the physics of judgment, turns the mountain into their tomb. It liquefies the granite. The mountain literally falls on them, exactly as they asked. The shield becomes the weapon.
And then, to counter that apocalyptic vision, Enfield introduces the concept of Yisrael. In ancient Hebrew, the name translates to one who wrestles with God. It originates from the biblical story of Jacob, who spends an entire night physically wrestling with a divine being. He refuses to let go, even when his hip is dislocated. He wrestles through the darkness, and he limps away at dawn with a new name, Yisrael, and a blessing. Enfield argues that humanity's relationship with this new, terrifying level of physical power is an ongoing, limping struggle.
Because the core truth of the essays is that the technology is agnostic. The technology required to violently crack open the crust of Venus to lock away carbon and spawn oceans is the exact same technology that can pierce a command bunker on Earth in a silent 11-second hypersonic strike.
Right.
The physics doesn't know the difference. The tungsten rod doesn't know if it is hitting a hostile military command center or a barren Martian ice sheet. The nuclear reactor doesn't know if it's powering a defensive acoustic shield or a terraforming laser. Only human intent knows the difference.
The physics is completely neutral. The hardware is inherently dual use. The covenant we make as a species about how we choose to aim at physics is everything. We are wrestling with the power of the gods, and we have to decide if we want the blessing or the destruction.
Think about the sheer scale of what we're talking about today. If you are a general sitting in a bunker 100 meters under a mountain, you think you are safe. But we live in a world where the fundamental laws of physics, combined with the sudden, dramatic collapse of commercial space launch costs, have essentially handed us the keys to the universe. We have built a tool that can either end human civilization in an afternoon or seed the stars with new life.
It raises what is perhaps the most important question of our century. In the field of astrobiology, there is a famous concept called the Great Filter. It is a theoretical evolutionary barrier that prevents advanced civilizations from expanding across the galaxy. We look up at the stars and wonder why it's so quiet. We usually assume the Great Filter is a technological hurdle. Can a species invent fusion power? Can they master orbital mechanics? Can they build artificial intelligence without it destroying them?
But what if that isn't the filter at all? What if the real great filter for an advanced civilization isn't whether they are smart enough to discover mountain-moving physics, but whether they possess the spiritual, ethical, and institutional maturity to aim that physics outward at the dead planets, rather than aiming it downward at themselves?
The physics is sitting there, waiting for us. The mountain is waiting.
The kings and the generals are sitting in their bunkers right now, 80 meters deep, looking at radar screens, hoping the rock is thick enough, hoping the sky stays quiet. What happens when they finally realize the mountain isn't a shield anymore? We'll leave you to think about that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Okay, so today we're talking about something that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a sci-fi movie, Rods from God. And I'm telling you, this isn't fiction anymore. We're going to dig into why a weapon that has 0 explosives might just be the most terrifying thing ever built. You've probably heard this quote from Einstein a million times, right? It's always seen as this dark prophecy about nuclear war. But what if we've been reading it all wrong? What if the sticks and stones part wasn't a metaphor at all? So where does an idea this wild even come from? You're probably thinking some top secret government lab, right? Nope. The story actually starts in a little town in Nebraska, of all places, that has 2 completely different but weirdly connected claims to fame. So, in one corner, you have the invention of Kool-Aid. Yeah, that Kool-Aid. And in the other corner, a massive ammunition depot that held, get this, 40% of the entire U.S. Navy's munitions during World War II. A sugary drink and a literal mountain of bombs. It sounds totally random, I know, but stick with me here. It all comes down to one single powerful idea. Concentrate, store, release. Think about it. Kool-Aid takes all that flavor and sugar and concentrates it into a tiny, easy-to-ship powder. The depot took apocalyptic levels of firepower and stored it away safely in bunkers. It's the exact same logic, just applied to very, very different things. Okay, so now let's scale that idea way, way up. I'm talking planetary scale. We're going to take that same principle and weaponize one of the most basic forces in the entire universe, gravity itself. The fancy term for this is kinetic bombardment. But forget the jargon for a second. There's no bomb here, no warhead, no nukes, nothing explosive at all. It's literally just a big, heavy, inert object dropped from space. It's basically a high-tech rock, a rock that's been weaponized by the laws of physics. And the physics behind it? They're actually pretty simple and, honestly, kind of terrifying. You probably remember this from high school. Kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared. The key part of that whole equation is squared. The mass matters, sure, but the velocity is the real killer. When you drop something from orbit, we're talking speeds of Mach 10. That's 10 times the speed of sound. And because of that v squared, that insane speed turns a simple metal rod into something with the punch of a tactical nuke. So why tungsten? Why not just use a big lead pipe? Well, tungsten is kind of like the superhero of metals for this job. First, it's super dense, almost twice as dense as lead. But the real magic is its melting point. It's over 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So when this thing screams back to Earth through the atmosphere, it can take the heat. It doesn't just vaporize like most other metals would. It actually makes it to the target. Okay, but if the idea is so simple, why haven't we seen these things before? Well, for a long, long time, this was just a cool idea on a whiteboard. Pure sci-fi. The physics worked, but the price tag? Absolutely impossible. Until now, because the economics of getting to space just went through one of the biggest revolutions ever. Let's put this in perspective. Back in the days of the space shuttle, putting just 1 kilogram, that's about the weight of a bag of sugar, into orbit cost a staggering $54,000. So launching just one of these tungsten rods would have cost over $500 million. The whole system? We're talking many billions. A complete non-starter. And then SpaceX happened. The Falcon Heavy came along and just shattered that price. Suddenly, the cost dropped to around $1,400 a kilogram. I mean, that's a 97% discount. The game had completely changed. But wait, it gets crazier. With Starship on the horizon, we're looking at costs under $100 per kilogram. Let that sink in. From $54,000 down to less than $100. That's not just an improvement. That's a whole new reality. And it makes a weapon like this not just possible, but kind of affordable. So what does that actually mean in terms of dollars and cents? Well, check this out. You could build a whole orbital platform with 6 of these rods for about $250 million. You know what else costs about that much? 2.5 F-35 fighter jets. But here's the difference. You can shoot down a jet. How in the world do you stop a metal pole hitting you at 10 times the speed of sound? So you're probably thinking, there's no way this is legal, right? A weapon this powerful has to be banned. And, well, that's where things get really, really interesting, and frankly, a little scary. The main treaty governing space was written over 60 years ago, and it had a very specific boogeyman in mind. Back in 1967, everyone was terrified of nukes in space. So the Outer Space Treaty was written to ban weapons of mass destruction from orbit. Simple enough, but here's the catch. What is a rod from God, legally speaking? It's not nuclear. It's not chemical. It's not biological. It is, for all legal purposes, a chunk of metal. It's a conventional weapon, and the treaty is completely silent on those. It's a loophole you could literally fly a spaceship from. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. This huge loophole is opening up right as the entire architecture of arms control is crumbling. The New START Treaty, the last real nuclear deal on the books, is on life support and basically dies in 2026. When it does, for the first time since 1972, there will be zero binding limits on the world's nuclear arsenals. It's kind of the perfect storm. So you have a new, terrifyingly powerful weapon that's getting cheap, and it's technically legal. What's the big deal? Well, the real danger here isn't just the explosion it makes. It's how it could completely upend the delicate balance of power that has kept the world from nuclear annihilation for decades. You see, the reason we haven't had a nuclear war is because of a grim but effective idea, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic goes like this. Even if you launch a surprise attack, you can't get all of my nukes. My leaders will survive in deep, hardened bunkers, and they will launch a second strike that wipes you out. Since nobody can win, nobody is stupid enough to start the fight. The whole thing, all of it, hinges on one single assumption, that those bunkers can't be destroyed, that leadership will survive to retaliate. But what if they can't? What if those bunkers, no matter how deep or strong, are suddenly vulnerable? And that's the end game. That's the real threat here. A rod from God can punch through hundreds of feet of rock and concrete. It can take out those so-called invulnerable bunkers. It gives a country the ability to launch a decapitation strike, to eliminate an enemy's leadership, and to do it without ever going nuclear. It pulls the one critical pin out of the entire structure of nuclear deterrence. So we're right back where we started, with Einstein. It turns out he was absolutely right. World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. He just didn't specify that the sticks would be made of tungsten and the stones would be dropping in from orbit. The oldest weapon in the book, a rock, has become the newest and maybe the most destabilizing. And it leaves us with a question that, honestly, nobody seems to have an answer to. How do you outlaw a rock?